I'm reading about let me see, World Asia News exclusive. South Sudan rebel leader says government derailing peace talks. South Sudan rebel leader Riek accused the government on Friday of ethnic cleansing and trying to sabotage peace talks in his first face-to-face interview since fighting erupted late last year in Africa's youngest nation. Dressed in dark green military fatigues and speaking to rulers in his bush hideout, branded president, a discredited leader who had lost the people's trust and should resign. Thousands have been killed and more than 500,000 have fled their homes since fighting erupted in the capital, Juba, in mid-December and spread quickly across the oil-producing nation, often following ethnic lines. The two sides signed a ceasefire on January 23 in the Ethiopian capital, Ababa, but each has accused the other of breaking it. Salva Kiir has committed atrocities in Juba. He has engaged in ethnic cleansing, and he is still involved in the process, said. His comments highlighted the gulf between the sides, who are meant to resume their troubled peace talks in Ethiopia next week. Regional and world powers are worried fighting could break out again and spill over into neighboring states. South Sudan's Justice Minister said this week that former Vice President and 6 of his closest allies should face treason charges, accusing him of trying to launch a coup. I'm not aware of why we should face those charges for an alleged coup that never happened. Say, it is another attempt to stop peace talks. Has regularly denied starting the violence or trying to seize power, and has accused the president of taking advantage of an outburst of fighting between rival groups of soldiers to round up political rivals. The United Nations and rights groups say both warring sides have committed atrocities in a conflict that has taken the country to the brink of civil war. The government and rebels both accuse each other of ethnically motivated killings. Human Rights Watch said earlier this month that government SPLA forces have targeted civilians from group in Juba early on in the conflict, while rebel forces had butchered members of Kurd tribe in other towns. Guns and laundry. In bush camp, hidden in a thorny scrub of South Sudan's West Jungly state, which has untapped oil reserves. Assault rifles stood propped up against a tree, and laundry hung dying in the branches. Nearby, a former mining and energy minister in the United sitting before the South succeeded in 2011, was typing on a laptop in front of a tent. The rebel leader said Kerr has lost the support of the country's 11 million people. 11 million people asks what he wanted from the peace talks. Who was sacked by Kerr in July, said he had no interest in being reinstated as vice president. It would be best for Kerr to resign. We are due for elections in 2015. Before the elections, there will be an interim government, Marshall said, declining to say who might lead it. Blamed the army for ceasefire violations. The army was, he said, battling to extend its control outside the towns. The towns of near the country's main oil fields and borders setting off some of the heaviest clashes. Regional leaders said on Friday they aim to deploy the first members of the team to monitor the shaky ceasefire at the weekend. Even so, obstacles still lie in the way of the peace talks restarting on time. 4 of the 6 senior political figures accused of treason alongside Machar are in detention in Juba. Machar pressed for their release after the government on Wednesday freed 7 other detainees, but declined to say if he would call back his negotiators if the government refused. It will not be an inclusive peace process if they are not there. A non-exclusive process would hurt the people of Sudan, he said. Machar said Kerr had only survived the uprising because his military had intervened. Has admitted its army provided air and ground support to Kerr's troops, raising concerns among diplomats that the wider region could be sucked into the conflict. If it was not for interference of the we would be in Juba now, said. Asked if that means he would be in power, he replied, not necessarily, but Kerr wouldn't have been president. I'm now reading about Germany should play bigger role in world. German President Joachim opened an international security meeting Friday with an appeal for his country to play a greater role on the world stage and in tackling global trouble spots. Germany should engage as a good partner earlier, more decisively and more substantially. He told hundreds of political, diplomatic, and defense leaders at the Munich Security Conference, MSC, a new meeting of the Global Strategy Community was set to deal with thorny international issues, from the Syrian war and Ukraine's turmoil to Iran's nuclear program and U.S. online surveillance. The high-powered guest list at the meeting includes UN chief, some 20 heads of state and government, 10 leaders of international organizations, 5 EU commissioners, and many military analysts. Host country Germany, the EU's biggest economy, has long stuck to an approach of military restraint and been criticized for not for not playing a military role that matches its economic and political weight. In his opening address asked, Are we doing what we can to stabilize our neighborhood? In the East and in Africa, are we doing what should to counter the dangers of terrorism? And if we find compelling reasons to engage military together with our allies, are we then ready to fairly share the risks with them? Edith Gauck, the head of state, seems a moral authority in Germany. What role do we want to play in crisis in distant parts of the world? Are we sufficiently engaged in the area where Germany has developed competence in conflict prevention? I say Germany should engage as a good partner earlier, more decisively and more substantially. Germany's military role will fit into a wider debate on transatlantic security operational cooperation at the 50th edition of the MSC, an event first launched in the Cold War. One of the key concerns of Europe is the future role of the United States, which has guaranteed regional security since World War II, but which has increasingly switched its force to Asia. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel were Saturday to address U.S. to European ties, but their presence has in part been overshadowed by the NSA surveillance scandal. Kerry acknowledged Friday in Berlin that relations with Germany had gone through a rough period of late over NSA snooping, but that shared security priorities would keep the countries close. I'm now reading about world stocks slide on emerging market woes. Global stock markets fell on Friday as concerns persisted over the outlook for emerging economies. The financial market in several developing countries have been shaken for the past week by concerns that growth will slow and money will flow out of their economies as the U.S. Federal Reserve tightens its monetary policy, drain on global liquidity. The Turkish lira and the South African rand fell on Friday before recovering somewhat. The Hungarian forint and Russian ruble were less resilient, trading down 0.7% and 0.5% against the dollar by the end of the European trading day. Investors are worried that the jitters in emerging markets will hurt those economies, which have been among the fastest growing in recent years. In Europe, Germany's DAX fell 0.6% to close at while France's CAC 40 fell percent to Britain's FTSE 100 dropped 0.5% to Wall Street traded lower as well, with the Dow down 0.8% at and the S&P 500 down 0.5% at European markets were further weighed by news that the inflation rate in the 18 countries Eurozone dropped to 0.7% in December from 0.9% the previous month. That is far below the European Central Bank's target of just under 2% and has raised expectations of rate cuts next week. The data maintain the pressure on the ECB to do more toward of deflation risks. Perhaps as soon as next week, said chief European economist and capital economics. The possibility of looser monetary policy weighed on the euro, which has traded down 0.4% at Earlier in Asia, many markets were closed for the Lunar New Year holidays. Japan's Nikkei 225, the main index still trading, reversed early gains that were sparked by reported increases in inflation and factory output. Inflation is a possible sign of economic recovery in Japan, which has been plagued by falling prices during 2 decades of stagnation. But the rise in the yen against the US dollar was negative for exporting stocks, dragging the Nikkei down 0.6% to The dollar was down 0.5% against the yen at yen. Financial markets were closed in China, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Among stock markets, not observing the holiday, India's Sensex gained less than 0.1%, and Thailand's SET was up 0.4%. Australia's S&P 200 added less than 0.1%, and New Zealand's benchmark gained 0.5%. Among stock markets not observing the holiday, this paragraph. Benchmark U.S. crude for March delivery was down 36 cents at a barrel in electronic trading on the New Year exchange. The contract gained 87 cents on Thursday. Let's do Latin America. I'm now reading about, not this one, I want to read this one. Exclusive in diplomatic shift. Europe seeks improved ties with Cuba. The European Union will agree next month to deepen relations with Cuba in its most significant overture to the communist nation since diplomatic sanctions were lifted in 2008. People close to the matter told the rulers. Foreign ministers from the EU's 28 countries will give the go-ahead on February 10th to launch talks with Havana on a special cooperation accord to increase trade, investment, and dialogue on human rights. The pact could be agreed upon by the end of 2015. Cuba wants capital, and the European Union wants influence, said one person involved in the talks who declined to be named because of the sensitivity of the issue. This cooperation could serve as a prelude to much more. 2 other people in acknowledge of the negotiations told Reuters that a consensus had been reached in Brussels to give momentum to the market-oriented reforms introduced under Cuban President Raul Castro, and to position European companies for any transition to a more capitalist economy in the longer term. The opening with Europe comes after Cuba this week won a diplomatic victory at a summit meeting of Latin American and Caribbean leaders in Havana. At the summit, 33 countries from the region on Wednesday backed the right of their neighbors to choose their own political systems, a victory for Cuba as the only one-party state in the Western Hemisphere. Taken together, the steps by the EU and Latin American nations highlight warming ties with Cuba, in sharp contrast to the United States, which has imposed an economic embargo on Cuba since 1962 after serving diplomatic ties in the year before. Washington has previously exerted pressure on Europe and Latin America to isolate the Cuban government, but it has not sought to block the EU's latest efforts, people close to the talks said. While U.S.-Cuba relations have taken a more pragmatic tone recently, which officials from both sides pointing to improvement, Americans have barely budged since easing Cuban travel restrictions in 2011. The U.S. government says Cuba must improve human rights and release imprisoned U.S. contractor Alan Gross, who was sentenced to 15 years for attempting to establish an illegal communications network on the island. We'll continue to look at this balance as to how do we advance necessary changes that could improve the situation, but at the same time continue to express our concerns on these human rights issues. Ben Rhodes, President Barack Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, told reporters on Wednesday the initial impact of EU to Cuba cooperation agreement will be limited, but the symbolism is huge for the EU, whose ties with Cuba have been strained since it imposed sanctions in 2003 in response to Havana's arrest of 75 dissidents. Let me find it. Here. The initial impact of EU to Cuba cooperation agreement will be limited. So the symbol of this one is, I have read this one, this paragraph. Let's continue. Although the EU lifted those sanctions in 2008, the normalization of relations has been tortuous because of resistance from Poland and the Republic due to their own communist past. People close to the talks say Poland and the Republic now back a deal with Cuba. The last time Cuba and the EU came close to negotiating an economic cooperation agreement was in 1996. But the Europeans called off talks in the wake of the shooting down of two small U.S. planes by Cuba off its shores, killing 4 Cuban exiles aboard. As a result, the EU adopted its common position on its common position on Cuba in December 1996, placing human rights and democracy conditions on improved economic relations. Havana rejects the common position as interference in its internal affairs. Transition. In a sign of impatience with the status quo, the Netherlands sent its foreign minister to Havana in January, this first such trip by the Dutch since the 1959 Cuban Revolution broke with EU policy of limiting high-level visits. Spain, the former colonial power in Latin America and the Caribbean, has also been pushing for a change of approach since early. Long-time Cuban leader Fidel Castro handed power to his younger brother Raúl in 2008. Some EU countries see the 1996 Common Position policy as outdated because 18 EU governments have signed bilateral agreements with Cuba outside the Common Position, making it hard for the bloc to speak with one voice. Still, Spanish Foreign Minister José has been adamant that the Common Position will remain for the time being, while the European Commission, the EU executive, negotiates the cooperation pact. If Europe wants to have a presence when there's a transition in Cuba, the EU has to start working now. It's right to start dialogue now so that Europe isn't absent when the transition happens, said Carlos Marlin, head of Latin American research at the Rio Institute, a think tank in Madrid. A cooperation pact, which the EU has used as a tool in the past to strengthen relations with Central America and Asia. It's not likely to increase trade greatly because Cuba sells very little to Europe. Besides cigars and rum, Cuba's exports are not huge interest to the EU, but Brussels believes developing business ties is the best way to press for change in Cuba. The European Union is Cuba's biggest foreign investor and Cuba's second biggest trading partner after and a third of the tourists to the island every year come from the EU. Cuba has opened a Chinese-style special economic zone and is preparing a new foreign investment law. It is seeking foreign investment at its port facilities in Merrill Bay to take advantage of the expansion of the Panama Canal. I'm now reading about, I want to change something to read. Let's read science. This one. I'm now reading scientists have breakthrough in embryonic-like stem cells. What the hell? In experiments that could open a new era in stem cell biology. Scientists have found a simple way to reprogram mature animal cells back into an embryonic-like state that allows them to generate many types of tissue. The research, described as game-changing by experts in the field, suggests human cells could in future be reprogrammed by the same technique, offering a simpler way to replace damaged cells or grow new organs for sick and injured people. Chris Mason, chair of regenerative medicine by Progression at University College London, who was not involved in the work, said its approach in mice was the most simple, lowest cost, and quickest method to generate so-called pluripotent cells able to develop into many different cell types from mature cells.